More, I'm joined again by Carice Whitty, who pioneered the Israel Studies program in China, plus Professor Aryeh Sapoznik, Associate Professor at Ben-Gurion University and Vice President of the Association for Israel Studies. Plus, I'm also joined by Professor Sway Shojun from the Executive Director of Middle East and African Studies at Renmin University. Thank you all so much for joining me. Now, Carice, I want to begin with you. Now, you developed this entire program in China. What made you want to develop Israel Studies as a program in China in the first place?
So I am a Zionist, and I really wanted to give back to the country I love. But in 1987, when I made Aliyah, there were no official relations between China and Israel. So my Yale University degree in Chinese studies and all those years I had spent in the mid-'80s working in China, learning the language, were not really useful. But then in 2009, after the subprime global economic crash, I started to look at what was happening between Israel and China, because they both came out of it pretty well. And I learned that there was no study of Israel in China at all. Then in 2010, when I was gearing up to start the program, China was declared the world's second largest economy. And at the same time, China said it was going to transition from being a manufacturer to a global innovator. And that cinched it for me. Definitely, China would eventually be coming to Israel for innovation. It would need more energy from the Middle East. And it was critical that China would learn about Israel at the university level, especially places like China Foreign Affairs University that produces most of China's ambassadors.
Well, let's talk to someone at one of those universities. Professor Sway, I want to bring you into the conversation. You are a professor at Renmin University, one of China's top 5. Now, I understand that you originally reached out to Signal back in 2014 to bring Israel Studies to the School of International Studies at Renmin. Why did you consider Israel Studies to be so important?
All right. So China is becoming a global power in economics and politics. But if you look at China's study priority, it has long been focused on the U.S. study and also UN study. So we need to reach to the regions, areas. Israel is a very important country in the Middle East. So there are 4 reasons why Israeli studies are so important in China. The first, I think China, Israel, or the Jewish people, Chinese people, we have a very good friendship. It can be traced back to the Second World War. We all know that a lot of Jewish refugees came to Shanghai and in order to escape their persecution from the Nazi Germany. So the second reason is really a small country in size and population, but a big country in technology and innovation. And China is steadily pursuing its road under modernization and industrialization. So I think it's really science and technology could be very complementary to China's, persuasion to be a modern socialist country. So we can gain strengths from the interaction with the Israeli scholars to study other countries in the region. The last but not least is Israel has a very good higher education system. There's a growing number of Chinese students. They want to go to Israel to pursue their degree study, both as a master or the PhD candidate. So these are all the reasons why I think we should strengthen the Israeli study in my university.
Great. And Professor Sapoznik, last year Signal sent you to China to give a series of lectures on Israel Studies to its partner universities. Now, you have lectured at quite an international set of students over the years, yet you have said that lecturing in China was a real eye-opener. Tell us a little bit about your experience and why it was so eye-opening.
It was. Well, I'll tell you, in fact, we have an international master's program here at the Ben-Gurion Research Institute for Israel and Zionism. And we find that every encounter internationally with Israel studies sheds new light on the study of Israel itself. And going to China was particularly interesting. The kinds of questions and the kinds of motivation for interest echo what we've just heard. I think there's a lot of interest in Israel as a high-tech leader, and a great deal of interest that's closer to my own research perspective in terms of two nations, two peoples that have ancient roots and that have created modern cultures at the same time. And so the kinds of encounters with faculty and students that I had in China were incredibly enlightening, both in both directions. I was able to learn a great deal, not only about Chinese culture, but in fact, new perspectives on Israel studies itself.
Okay, Carice, I'm going to bring you back into the conversation. You were working with over 20 universities in China, from the eastern border right over to the far west. Now, this is 3,000 universities in this country. How do you pick which universities to work with, and where do you decide where to go?
Well, it's definitely a process. We are looking at the universities and understanding where we can be most effective. One of the reasons we've been able to be successful is because we're basically dealing with Israel itself and Israel's strengths. The fact that Israel is an innovator, as you heard, is a key interest of these universities. Other universities are very interested in the fact that Israel is a regional power. But one of the most important reasons that many universities are interested in working with us, and we have quite a wide choice, is the Belt and Road Initiative that was launched by President Xi Jinping, because as China is trying to move goods from the east to Europe, they recognize that Israel is a land bridge connecting the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. So because we identified these interests and we were able to reach out to universities and offer them the opportunity to learn about these critical areas, we were able to choose universities that were most relevant to us.
And Professor Sway, you mentioned about there was many Jewish people that had migrated to China, and we know that Jewish studies is something that has been studied in Chinese universities for decades, as Owen mentioned in his report earlier on. Is there an overlap at all between these areas of study?
Yes. Jewish study has long been existing in Chinese university, but roughly they can be divided into three categories. The first category is a Hebrew language study. In China, there are a lot of several universities they are teaching on the language study. So Hebrew language is one of the important languages they are teaching for decades. The second category is about the history study. In China, there's quite a number of universities. They have a well-established disciplinary to study the history, the Jewish history, and also Israeli history, Middle East history. The third category is a university that study the contemporary political and economic of the Middle East. And my university, for example, is established my school established in 1950 by Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai. After this country founded in 1949, immediately that the Chinese authority realized it's very important to strengthen China's international politics study. And then we know that we have to focus on contemporary economic and political study or different region and area. So Middle East is very important for China, particularly since the Belt and Road Initiative was launched by the Chinese President Xi Jinping. So Middle East, as Chris put out, is a land bridge to connect China with the Europe. So in this background, and we need to strengthen the study of the region. There are a lot of important issues like the oil politics and the Iran nuclear issue, and also the peace process and many other issues. So we are focused on contemporary economic and political studies of the region.
Okay, now, Professor Saposnik, we tend to take for granted the culture that we grow up in, and given that the Chinese students do not have a Judeo-Christian background and many bits of knowledge and information built into our culture and society, basics that we take for granted are not there, what is it like to teach Israel studies?
So you're in fact correct. There are certain things that we do take for granted in teaching Israel studies, certainly to Western audiences. Zionism, for example, resonated and echoed many biblical motifs which are familiar in Western culture. These often have to be explained to students or even to faculty who do not have that same background. But at the same time, as I said earlier, this notion of ancient cultures and their translation into the making of a modern national culture, which is a phenomenon that we're very familiar with in the context of Zionism and Israel, this is something that resonates, I think, very powerfully, as I've found with Chinese students who have asked me a great deal about the making of modern Hebrew culture and its relationship with ancient Hebrew culture. And so bridging some of these gaps, there are certainly areas of interest that are mutual and that can be shared.
Okay, and Carice, before we finalise the show, just one more question for you briefly. If there were no Israel studies courses in China prior to 2011, how did you find university faculties to teach about Israel, and how do you prepare these educators so that they're well versed on how to accurately teach about Israel studies?
Well, we work with the Chinese faculty, and we bring them to Israel and give them an opportunity to experience Israel. I think many of your viewers know how valuable it is to actually be here. So when they come and they can feel the land and meet the people as well as study, they are able to go back and integrate Israel into their area of expertise. And our advice to them is don't take anything for granted.
Absolutely, that is a good message. Carice Whitty, Professor Sui-Sho Jun, and Professor Aryeh Sapoznik, thank you all so much for joining us.